we're going to give it a try. We're going to see if we finish up here today. I'm fairly optimistic that we can in our History of the Churches series. We've made it all the way to the very end, and we started with the History of the Churches books, and then the book History of the Churches, and then I've been basing the rest of it on the Fundamentalism and Fundamental Baptists history. So finishing up that as well. And before we get into the last part of this series, this lesson, I really should have added something on that this is not in any of the books that I've been using, but something that is very pertinent to Baptists today. What is going on among independent Baptists is the trend toward a post-tribulation, pre-wrath rapture position. And along with that then comes some unscriptural doctrine on the nation of Israel. And so specifically I would mention Stephen Anderson, who is an independent Baptist. And over the years he had gained a following online on YouTube. He had a very large influential YouTube channel. In the last year or two, that ended up getting taken down by YouTube. He's pretty much not all of his content is gone from YouTube, but much of his content is gone from YouTube. I guess they got to the point where they didn't want him on there anymore. But he denies the severity, or at the very least the severity of the Holocaust, and tries to downplay the Holocaust. And he's got unscriptural doctrine on the nation of Israel, and on basically believing in replacement theology, that nation of Israel's done because they're so wicked and so heathen, and they reject Christ, and of course those things are true as far as the rejection of Christ as the Messiah, as a nation they have. But the Bible explains all of that, how that's all going to play out. And so then he gets his unscriptural doctrine on the rapture from Matthew 24. So when you hear somebody start their doctrine on the rapture, as far as the first scripture they go to on the doctrine of the rapture with Matthew 24, the red flag should go up. Because Matthew 24 is not primarily a rapture passage. That is not one of the primary rapture passages. That particularly deals with the events leading up to Christ's kingdom and the end of the world. So what they do is they'll take the verse that the elect will be gathered from the four winds in Matthew 24, and they'll say, see, that's the rapture, but there's tribulation up to that point, and then after that, the wrath of God. I'll tell you what I believe. It's another rapture during the tribulation. For lack of a better term, another rapture. It is the elect, that is the saved remnant that God is that is saved during the tribulation, that then God gathers during that time. So maybe don't call it a rapture. I don't know if I should call it a rapture, but it's gathering the elect from the four winds. So anyway, I'm not getting into the specifics of all of that today. But basically, I'm just saying that is not a rapture passage. That is not a rapture verse. That is not the rapture verse for us. That is something that happens during the tribulation. It's something that happens toward the end of the tribulation, that there's the gathering of the elect. And that elect has to do with the nation of Israel. The elect has to do with those who are saved during the tribulation. So if you want to go home and read Matthew 24 and then ask me about it later, that's fine. But anyway, so... but they take Matthew 24, and unfortunately those who believe in a pre-tribulation rapture have also misused Matthew 24, some of the verses there that are not talking about the rapture, and then they say it's talking about the rapture, so then that actually hurts the case for the pre-tribulation rapture, because then those who don't believe in the pre-tribulation rapture will then see, well, see, they've said this from Matthew 24, but that's not right, and which is true, it's not right. So, like I said, I wish we could get into Matthew 24 today. We're not going to get into Matthew 24 today. The point is that Matthew 24 is primarily a passage that describes about the tribulation and the second coming of Christ. There is a portion of the very first few verses of the chapter that may be referring to things prior to the rapture, but that is not a rapture passage. And one reason why it's not a rapture passage is that Paul said, "Behold, I show you a mystery." The rapture was a mystery that was not revealed up until that point. In as clear of terms, Jesus was not revealing that mystery. Paul was the one who revealed the mystery of the rapture for New Testament saints. So anyway, the point is that if someone starts their doctrine on the rapture with Matthew 24, that's the wrong place to start your doctrine on the rapture. Bible prophecy, and particularly the rapture, the second coming of Christ, the tribulation, there's not one hard and fast passage you go to get all of your doctrine about that. Now, 1 Corinthians 15 and then Thessalonians, that's where you get the specifics of the rapture itself. It doesn't necessarily completely give you the timing of the rapture in those specific cases. But when you put all of the scriptures together about you first of all, you got to have your doctrine right about the nation of Israel. You got to have that's the foundation of it. You get your doctrine right on the nation of Israel, you won't have a problem with the prophetic passages about the rapture and about the tribulation. But it starts with the replacement theology doctrine, which then from there, then that affects, and that's, by the way, that's just Augustinian Catholic Reformed doctrine. That's what that is. That's replacement theology. That's Augustinianism. It's Catholicism. It's Reformed theology. Anyway, but Steven Anderson didn't, he says that he got this from just sitting down when he was a younger age, and he sat down and he opened his Bible and he read Matthew 24, and he just all of a sudden came to this by himself. Now here's how I know that that's really a bunch of baloney, is that he was in a church in California. Now he went to Hyles-Anderson College for a year or so. He wasn't really happy with the place, but he maintained some of their soul-winning tactics and the easy, quick prayerism type of thing. He did retain that. But on the other hand, he doesn't believe church nurseries are biblical, completely family integrated, so that's where he would be completely different from Hyles-Anderson College and First Baptist of Hammond. But he was in a church in California that was pastored by Roland Rasmussen, and Roland Rasmussen believed in the pre-wrath rapture doctrine, and he got that from, there was a book that was published back in the late 80s, I think it was late 80s, by Marvin Rosenthal, called The Pre-Wrath Rapture. And Marvin Rosenthal was actually, I didn't realize this, he was actually the president of Friends of Israel ministry at one point. And Friends of Israel, they're not they're pre-tribulation as far as, especially Reginald Showers, I think he might still be the president of Friends of Israel ministry. And he's very much pre-tribulation. But Marvin Rosenthal wrote a book back, I think, late 80s or early 90s of the pre-wrath rapture. And that's where Roland Rasmussen got his doctrine. So Steven Anderson had influences in his life that got him thinking toward this pre-wrath rapture view. Now they would say they're pre-wrath or post-tribulation, meaning that the tribulation is the first part of the rapture, or first part of the 7 years, that we all go through tribulation, and then the wrath is the second half of the tribulation, and that's what we're delivered from. And then they'll use verses like Jesus said, "In the world ye shall have tribulation." Jesus said that, but be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. So they say, see, it says you'll have tribulation. Well, it doesn't mean that part of the tribulation. Just means you'll have tribulation, you'll have trials, you'll have troubles. And so anyway, he's been very influential, and there are some good qualities about Steven Anderson that if he's got a boldness that a lot of independent Baptist pastors don't have, and the problem is there are some very, very serious issues. And then of course, if you're familiar with him, he doesn't believe that any LGBT person can be saved, that they're reprobate, and so that's what got him in the most trouble with countries and social media platforms and that type of thing, was his teaching on that. One of his friends, who's a pastor, and they grew up as good friends. When that Orlando nightclub shooter went in there and to the gay nightclub and he shot up a bunch of people, his friend said, "I wish he would have just finished the job." In other words, just do that more. Do you think that's really going to stamp out homosexuality? Is that the answer? But to him, that was the answer, and Steven Anderson has said similar things in the past. And so So there are some good qualities about him, but at the same time, the negatives vastly outweigh the positives, and he's done great damage among independent Baptists because they're independent Baptists, especially younger ones, who look at him and they've followed him, and they've changed their doctrine, and that is a trend now. Fortunately, and I'm not saying whether I agree or disagree with him being taken off of YouTube. That's YouTube's business, but I will say that the blessing of him not having an online presence is that he doesn't have as much influence as he had before, where people have to dig a little hard, look a little harder, try a little harder to find him. They just can't go right to his YouTube channel. I mean, he's got everything on his website as far as sermons and stuff. But anyway, so that's something I wanted to address because that is a relevant and current issue among independent Baptists today that is there are people who have changed their doctrine because of his influence and that pre-wrath doctrine. But the pre-wrath doctrine, it's not new with Marvin Rosenthal when he wrote that book, but he's the one who really popularized it in the modern times, the idea of a pre-wrath rapture. When I was in college. In Florida in college, and I was working in the print shop, and a guy came up to me and he handed me these papers, and all of a sudden he just started in on this whole thing about, I don't know if it was about the rapture, about the tribulation. He just said, one thing we will know for sure is we will not see God's wrath. I'm thinking, okay, I mean, this was just out of the blue, out of nowhere. The guy walks up to me and hands me these papers. Well, the papers were a copy of an article or a part of a book or whatever it was by Marvin Rosenthal. And so he was trying to influence me as a college student. Now, he was an adult employee of the print shop. He was trying to influence me as a college student about the pre-wrath rapture. And the fact is, if you read what they say initially on the surface, it sounds very good, and there's a reason why people are going for it. But when you actually do a thorough Bible study and you look at the things that the verses they use, and first of all, you get your doctrine straight about Israel, then you find it doesn't hold water. It doesn't hold water. There are holes in their arguments. There are holes in the scriptures they use. The fact is, if I didn't believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, that would be the second option I would go to. Now, I don't plan to go to that second option. I don't have any intention because I believe the pre-tribulation rapture is right. But at the pre-7 years rapture, there's enough scripture and you put things together prophetically. But that is something to be very aware of, is that they're not preparing people for Jesus Christ. They're preparing people for Antichrist. The Bible doesn't tell us to look for Antichrist. The Bible tells us to be looking for Jesus Christ. And that's the blessed hope, and there's a comfort in. Anyway, I've heard him use so many scriptures out of context and misexplained, misrepresented. But I wanted to speak about him because he's been very influential. So that was not part of any of the books. That was just something I wanted to add in there. As one of the key issues facing independent Baptists today. So fundamentalism today. Non-denominational and interdenominational fundamentalism is essentially non-existent. Now, what that means is that this movement that encompassed many different denominations or people who are non-denominational, it is not a force to be reckoned with like it was in the decades past that we've been studying, we're looking at. Many of them have already transformed or in the process of transforming into new evangelical or just general broader evangelicalism. Because what you find is a lot of these, even there's still a number of Bible churches, and Bible churches you would consider fundamentalists. They're not Baptist, but they are fundamentalist in a lot of their doctrine for the most part. But many of them, and not all Bible churches are fundamentalists. Let me just say that there's a very large, influential Bible church. It's called Bible Church, McLean Bible Church, pastored by David Platt. And I think they're Southern Baptist. I don't know 100% sure. But anyway, he's gone full woke. Like he's. I mean, you want to talk about. I mean, the anti-racist stuff. I mean, just the whole. I mean, some of the nonsense he's been doing, involved in it, and it's pretty pathetic, actually. I mean, if you watch some of his clips, anyway, it's sad. It's just sad. It's not, but I wouldn't call them fundamentalists. They're more evangelical types. Interdenominational fundamentalism essentially non-existent. So the ones that do remain might have mostly sound doctrine, but they don't take a stand on issues of holy living and are not teaching the people the specifics of convictions and standards. They're not being taught here's where we stand and why when it comes to holy living and convictions. Some of them might still have fairly conservative music. Many of them don't use the King James Bible. They use other versions, and I do know many of the books that the people are going to read, and a lot of their influence is going to be more of the evangelical or new evangelical type influences. So they're not fundamentalists. They're not. Although, as we've already learned about fundamentalism, there was already a level of soft separatism, and so that just compounds over the years. In The Tragedy of Compromise, Ernest Pickering, he wrote this in 1994. Ernest Pickering, who was a fundamentalist, wrote, "The new evangelicalism has continued to grow apace. From the small beginnings of the 1950s has come a large and pervasive movement which has captured churches, schools, parachurch organizations. Those opposing it have been labeled as loveless bigots and narrow-minded obscuriants. All over America and the world at this hour there are churches that are drifting into new evangelicalism without the remotest knowledge that they are doing so. They are being carried along with the shifting winds of compromise and have long since departed from the solid biblical position established by their predecessors. Young pastors, many without firm doctrinal underpinnings, have led their churches to believe that in order to reach the masses, they must abandon the strict biblical principles of yore and embrace more fluid and attractive positions. Many saints, firmly indoctrinated by former pastors in clear and uncompromising positions, are now bewildered and drifting from church to church, seeking some stability." So in other words, there's been a merging, a blending, a homogenizing. The distinctions have been done away with, and this is what you're finding among even a lot of different denominations. That might believe a lot of the same basic fundamental principles. There's a blending into the broader evangelicalism, and then some go even further into the emerging. But I got to thinking about this when I saw his quote about embrace more fluid and attractive positions. It made me think of people who are gender fluid. But this was written in 1994. How many people were gender fluid in 1994? So the churches were becoming fluid before the genders were becoming fluid. I wonder if there's a correlation there. As the churches have weakened, so has the country weakened. And now we're at the point where people are just gender fluid, and more and more people. But I mean, I see them. I'm working in the world. I see them. They're around here. And it's a sad thing to see. But before that, the more fluid and attractive positions were adopted, and someone has said, as the churches go, so goes the nation, and I believe that in large part that's right. I mean, people can yell about the liberals all they want, the progressives, but and let me just tell you, the conservative movement is not the answer. Is not going to save America. I mean, it is not going to save America. The conservative movement, and morally, in a lot of ways, morally is just as corrupt as the liberals. Liberals are just more honest about their corruption. Basically, you might vote more conservative just because it gives us a fighting chance to preserve what we have left. That's pretty much any reason I vote conservative, is just not with these high hopes like, yep, we're going to save America at the next election. It's like, no, I'm just trying to keep us from, let's go off toward the cliff at 10 miles an hour instead of 100 miles an hour, But what's really going to save America is if we have revival in the churches and widespread repentance among the Christians of America. Many Baptists have also transformed into a form of evangelicalism. Many churches have closed, are dying, and are barely hanging on, or have moved in a completely different direction. And I mean, we witnessed this when we were traveling. We saw I mean, we saw a church. I mean, it was a big church building. This was in Missouri when we went to that church on a Sunday morning, and it's a tiny handful of people that were left. And I mean, they were 1 or 2 deaths away. I mean, and a couple of the members they had were pretty much not all very elderly, which nothing wrong with having elderly members, of course. But there was nobody else. That was it. You had the pastor, and you had maybe an assistant or a song leader, or teacher, or somebody else. But I said to her, I said, they're 1 or 2 deaths away from not having a church anymore. I mean, literally. And but it was a beautiful facility. They were meeting downstairs in a classroom. That was where they had their service, because it was cold, I think, that time of year. It was cold. Well, then you walk into the hallway, and the hallway's dark and cold. They don't have the sanctuary open. So somebody drove in. We were there that day. We just happened to be in the area, so we just dropped into that church. And somebody drove in, presumably to come to church, and the pastor turns around and he looks out the window, this little window from downstairs, a little window you can see out to the parking lot. And somebody comes to the door. They went up to the door. They didn't even get out of the vehicle. So they drive in. They're looking around, and then they drive away. And he says, "Yeah, they usually do that." We're thinking, of course they do. Of course they do. You don't look like you're open. Basically, you're holed up. We thought they weren't open. You're holed up in this little classroom rather than meeting upstairs. And because they didn't want to heat the sanctuary, they probably didn't have money to heat the sanctuary. But that was an indication. That was a dying church. It was at one time an independent. I mean, it was an independent Baptist church, but they were on the brink of. I mean, they weren't going to be able to keep that building. And guess who moves into those buildings after the Baptists move out? It's usually the Pentecostals. It's usually the Charismatic, the Evangelicals. It's the emerging. It's all the ones that shouldn't have the buildings. And there are pastors out there who, if someone would just contact them and say, look, we have this building, our church is struggling, there are some resources, they could save those buildings and those churches. But usually it's too late. They don't try to pursue any other option. They just, well, I guess that's it. And that's what's happened to a lot of churches. Or they have moved in a completely different direction. Many independent Baptists are yoking with Southern Baptists. So we're seeing that as well. Younger independent Baptists are finding more common ground and common cause and with the Southern Baptists, and we're not for that fundamental independent stuff.
I just wonder if you can define evangelicalism in some ways.
Well, evangelicalism is it's a very broad term. I mean, they would just say we do believe in Jesus. We believe that Jesus is the way of salvation. They'll even say they believe in God's Word, and they believe in the virgin birth. They'll believe in the basic. It'd be like the next liberal step from fundamentalism. It's a step down from fundamentalism, where they're even broader than the fundamental movement. So, evangelical. It's hard to define because it's such a broad term. Because you can have charismatics who are considered evangelicals. You can have, you can have all kinds of different denominations that are considered evangelicals. So there's really no one group you can say, as far as the way the world, if the media uses the term evangelicals, it's a pretty broad. It's just talking about just your general Christians. They're not distinguishing.
But it'd be Protestants in general, right? That would have been under that.
It'd be
like a Catholic.
No, it's not Catholics. Although there are some who call themselves evangelical Catholics.
See, I knew there's a reason I'm confused.
As a matter of fact,
a lot of people call fundamental Baptists evangelical.
Oh yeah. As a general term, evangelical is like a catch-all term for. As a matter of fact, even Mike Pence, I think, has been termed as like an evangelical Catholic. Like he's got a Catholic background, but he's an evangelical, and I don't think he attends a Catholic church. I think he attends a non-denominational, but I don't know. But it's a blending. It's the blending. Back in I think the early 90s, there was an agreement, like a political agreement, called Evangelicals and Catholics Together, that we're going to fight these political movements. We're going to be pro-life. We're going to stand for these things. And so the evangelicals and Catholics have been blending more because of political. Fundamentalism as a movement means nothing, but being a fundamental Baptist is still important. So I'm not worried about the fundamental movement. I'm not even really that worried about the term fundamental Baptist, except for the fact it sets us apart from denominational Baptists. So it tells us, okay, we're independent Baptists, we're independent Bible-believing Baptists, but yeah, if someone calls us a fundamental Baptist, it just means we're not the denominational type Baptists. So that term still has some meaning to it, but it's not one where I'm just, I'm a fundamental Baptist. You know? Because, and here's the thing, the term fundamentalist has actually gotten a bad rap because you can have fundamentalist Muslims, and those are the ones who commit the terror attacks. And really, so what is the least popular in the world? Whatever religion is the most fundamental, or whatever part of a religion is most fundamental. Whether you're fundamentalist Muslim, fundamentalist Mormon, fundamentalist Baptist, or whatever you might be, but yeah, if you're just that kind of everybody come together and blend a bit and let's all get along together, that's what the most attractive position is now in the eyes of the world. Because not all Muslims are the same. I mean, there are many Muslims who they'll get along with Catholics and Jews, and it's so a lot of different. And there's a lot of different. There's more of your fundamentalist Jews; those would be your Orthodox Jews, but those are more of your minority. And then you've got the Reformed Judaism, and very liberal, and so. But that's what sets us apart. There are churches, thankfully, there are churches that are still standing. There are churches that are still standing. And so while we've covered a lot in regard to the overall direction of fundamentalism and the churches overall, and if we want to just say broader, if we want to say Christianity as a whole, yes, we can say the overall trend has been a bad one, but that doesn't mean there aren't many churches that are still standing. So, and I wish we could have, we're not going to have time to finish this today, but we are going to look at some scriptures next week and talk about in the last days, churches in the last days of what we should still be doing in the last days. And it is possible to stand even in the last days. It is possible to stand even though the whole winds of doctrine have changed. Now, there's another guy who's been really, he's not a Baptist. I think he was a Baptist at one point. But another guy who's gotten hugely popular online on Facebook, and mostly because of his political views and his outspokenness, is his name is Greg Locke. And at one point, he had 1 million followers on Facebook. His videos, his clips would get hundreds of thousands, millions of views. And I was given, actually, I'd heard of Greg Locke back when I was in college. Someone gave me some preaching CDs of him. And at the time, I thought he was an independent Baptist evangelist. Are you familiar with him? As far as I know, he was an independent Baptist evangelist. I didn't know anything about him at the point, and he was very well spoken. He's very charismatic, very, what's that?
Very angry.
Well, he's
angry when he was preaching.
Pretty angry. But anyway, he pastors Global Vision Bible Church. And they're going kind of half charismatic too, but he ended up putting away his wife had some mental difficulties, which is probably because of living with him. It sounded like he was fairly abusive as far as verbally, emotionally abusive. And so he ends up sending her away to go get mental help. And then he marries his secretary very shortly after. And he takes part in these political rallies. He was there on January 6th, I think, or right about that time of January 5th and 6th when they were having the Stop the Steal rally, and he's up there and just completely given over to politics and the culture wars. But he said, now he's gotten so popular they can't fit everybody in his church building anymore, and he's in Tennessee, and so they put up this huge tent. And they're packing this tent out. And then actually, with one of the storm systems that came through, his tent got flattened. maybe by the hand of divine providence, I'm not sure. But then after that, I saw a clip of an interview with him, and he basically said, look, a lot of basically America getting back to God is going to come through a lot of celebrities. Kanye West. He even mentioned Britney Spears. Now, if you know what Britney Spears was posting ever since she got liberated from her, whatever the term, conservatorship, because she was under conservatorship for a number of years because of her mental health stuff. Basically, she ended up getting freed from that. But I mean, the stuff that she posts online, I haven't heard her mention anything about faith or God. I don't listen to Britney Spears. I don't even pay attention to what she's doing. So, but he mentioned something about Britney Spears talking about God or faith or Jesus, something about faith. And he's saying, like, it's people like that that are going to be what brings America back to God. Well, I don't even have to say anything to that. That's the height of absurdity. But no, Britney Spears is not bringing people back to God. Kanye West is not bringing people back to God. Kanye West is a guy who supposedly had a conversion experience. I am not going to say one way or another whether it was a genuine trust Christ conversion. I mean, he's a very disturbed individual, and he's still a very prideful individual, very self-promoting individual. So that makes me really question, or is that just simply he doesn't have anybody to teach him or disciple him, or who knows? I'm not saying whether or not Kanye West is actually saved. He needs help. He does need the Lord. But Kanye West is not going to be what brings America back to. And by the way, someone like Greg Locke, probably with his background, I don't know completely what his background is, but he should know better. He really should. It's probably far number of years removed from knowing better. But that is some of the greatest harms to biblical Christianity and are the ones who were part of it and then they left it. For whatever reason, they might have gotten disenfranchised, and there are some who for good reason have gotten disenfranchised, which is unfortunate. But there are churches that are still standing, and it is going to be, and this is what we'll look at next week when we finish this out, is that it's still going to be the same way. It continues the same way that God started it. So there's not some new way that God's going to bring people back, bring America back to Him. It's going to be the same way that He started it. And even if America as a country doesn't come back to God, what God's people need to do is still the same way that He started it. So it doesn't matter what happens in it. No matter which direction America as a country goes, which right now isn't good, but no matter what happens, whether that changes course or not, it goes back to the way that God started it. And I would say that the only way it's going to change course is if we get back to the way God started it. But we'll look at that a little bit closer next week. I'm just going to turn, just because I probably whet your appetite with this at the beginning, I'm going to turn to Matthew 24. And this is just completely off the cuff, so I'm not even going to get into depth here a little bit. But so he goes on, he says that, it talks about false prophets. There will be wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation. Now the disciples, they asked him, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? So this is talking about the second coming of Christ and the end of the world. And also talking about, he started with the destruction of the temple, but Jesus gave them a lot more than that. But it talks about false prophets, the beginning of sorrows, being delivered up, being killed, hated of all nations for my name's sake. Verse 13, but he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. And notice that is the gospel of the kingdom. And that was the gospel that was originally preached when Jesus came, because repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. But when the nation of Israel rejected Christ as their Savior, they had him put to death, then the gospel that was being preached was the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. That's the gospel we preach. And yes, there's still the coming kingdom. But he says this gospel, the kingdom, shall be preached in all the world for a witness to all nations. And notice verse 15, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So that's talking about the midpoint of that 7 years, when there's the abomination, the desolation of the temple. And then in verse 21, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time known or ever shall be, except those days should be shortened. There should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days should be shortened. In other words, there's going to come an end to it because of that remnant, because of the elect, though that remnant of saved people. And he talks about the elect in verse 20. Let's see. Okay, verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened. Now this is the portion that Stephen Anderson uses as a basis for his pre-wrath view. So he says, all right, after the tribulation. So there's the tribulation that goes up to the abomination of desolation, and there's the persecution that takes place. Then after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. That is not the rapture. That is not the rapture that's 1 Corinthians 15 or in Thessalonians. That's not the rapture. The rapture is what happens in the twinkling of an eye at the last trump. It's a twinkling of an eye. In a moment we shall be changed. That is not Jesus coming and everybody seeing Jesus coming. And then in verse 31, and he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. And see, they say, well, see, there's the trumpet. Now, I don't know if he realizes this. There can be more than one last trump. The last trump for the rapture is this particular age in which we're living. That's the last trump. There are more trumpets to come in the future. It doesn't mean it's the last trump of all time. It means that the last trump, that is for the age in which we're living, this New Testament church age. And we should know that there was already the first Trump because Donald Trump was president. And Pence was his vice president, so you had Trump-Pence. Almost Trump-bits. Trump-Pence. Okay, we know we're getting close. But anyway, he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So that is not a vertical thing. That's a gathering from the four winds, gathering them together, and it's his angels that are doing it. He's sending his angels. That's not the rapture. That's not us in a moment in the twinkling of an eye going to be with the Lord, meeting him in the air. That's a different event. But they equate that with the rapture. They say there's the tribulation, it's first. So there's great tribulation, then there's the rapture, because we see it right here in Matthew 24, and then the wrath of God is poured out on the earth. Verse 36, this is the verse that's typically used for the rapture. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. But this is primarily, Matthew 24 is primarily, it's once again, it's Matthew. It's from a very Jewish perspective of Christ setting up his kingdom and the end of the world. And then particularly that 7-year tribulation. It doesn't say the 7 years here, but that's where you put the various passages together. But this is the passage that they use. By the way, it's Matthew 24 is also the passage that the Jehovah's Witnesses use. It seems like if someone wants to have false doctrine, go to Matthew 24 first. Now, you don't have to have false doctrine if you go to Matthew 24 first. But it seems like some of the false doctrine about the last days, they like to focus on Matthew 24. Now the Jehovah's Witnesses use verse 45, who then is a faithful and wise servant? Now their Bible says faithful and discreet slave. So they take, now that is a rhetorical question. Jesus is asking a rhetorical question here. He's not saying there's a group of people that are the faithful and discreet slave. But that is what they call, Jehovah's Witnesses call the governing body. They say, well, this is the governing body is the faithful and discreet slave, and they give us our food. They give us our spiritual food. And that's the attitude Jehovah's Witnesses have, like they are just desperate, just like a baby for the mother's food, the mother's milk. They are so desperate and hungry for that food from the faithful and discreet slave. That's the attitude they have toward their learning. Because they can't think for themselves regarding the Bible passages. I've tried that. I've tested that. They do not know how to think for themselves when it comes to reading the Bible. And it's a sad thing. I'm not making fun of it. I'm not making light of it. I'm just saying that is the truth. And it's a sad thing. But they are deceived because of the misuse of Matthew 24. And people have been deceived by Stephen Anderson because of his misuse of Matthew 24. So I'm just saying, Matthew 24 is a great passage, very important prophetic passage. I mean, this is part of the Olivet Discourse. This is what we call the Olivet Discourse. And so it's a very important passage, and Brian Sharp preached from Matthew 24, a good message, good series of messages, I guess. So there's some good preaching on that, but just be careful about these winds of doctrine that are blowing. So we are going to pick up next week. We will finish next week, Josiah. That's it. We're right where we're at a good stopping point. Going to finish it up next week, and then I will actually next week after the lesson, then I will introduce where we're going from there. So what our next series of lessons is.